Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm not your host today, but I'm Connor Curtis, Director of Communications at Sierra Club Canada. And today we have a recording for you of a presentation Sierra Club Canada made to the Canadian Senate. Sierra Club Canada presented to a Senate committee examining Newfoundland and Labrador's offshore petroleum industry. We presented on offshore wind energy as an alternative and the problems with relying on oil and gas expansion economically. This recording is going to be followed by another recording of a presentation to the same Senate committee from Mi'gmawe'l Tplu'taqnn, or MTI, which represents several Mi'gma communities in New Brunswick. That presentation is about the lack of consultation on Equinor's Bay du Nord oil project. But before we play the recordings, I want to take a second to challenge some of the facts and the framing that you'll see in the recording by senators that suggests that this is a question of weaning Canada and Newfoundland and Labrador off oil and gas reliance for jobs and revenue, because that's not the issue. The issue is that the world is not going to need or want oil from Newfoundland and Labrador or Canada. This means that we rapidly need alternative energy solutions for employment and for revenue, both provincially and nationally across the country. Now, there's no singular fix that exists to that issue, but offshore wind is potentially a huge part of the solution here, which is why we're going to present on it. And if you're wondering why we can't do both oil and gas and renewable energy, well, I could point to the horrific climate change-driven forest fires and storms that have devastated whole communities in Canada, including Newfoundland and Labrador, and the fact that credible experts agree there is no such thing as green oil. But I sense that would not connect with many of those people in government who are thinking about these issues. So instead, I will again point to the fact that our situation is such that there simply is no business case, no demand case for oil and gas expansion anywhere, including in Canada. In fact, we are, as we are already seeing with LNG, facing a situation of coming oil and gas oversupply. So I also want to correct several incorrect statements made by the Senate committee. Oil demand will not continue to grow to the 2050s, and the International Energy Agency did not say that it would. As Oil Change International pointed out, recent claims that oil and gas demand would continue to grow globally past the 2030s are based on a single faulty scenario that the International Energy Agency had previously abandoned and only republished following pressure from the current US administration, which of course is quite close with oil and gas interests. Now, as Oil Change International points out, a peak in fossil fuels is still expected under the baseline trajectory of the STEPS scenario, which sees a near tripling of renewable energy capacity by 2035, even after accounting for US policy backsliding. The IEA still expects coal to decline before 2030, oil to peak around 2030, and gas to peak around 2035. Crucially, the IEA clarifies that the current policy scenario, that is, that obsolete scenario that the US forced them to publish alongside these other scenarios, an obsolete fossil fuel heavy scenario introduced under US pressure does not reflect business as usual. Instead, it implausibly assumes that existing policies and technology trends freeze or roll back, portraying the US administration fantasy rather than the reality of today's rapidly evolving energy market. Again, we are going to see countries rapidly push towards renewables even more so than before, because when you have a very chaotic and aggressive US administration that has a huge influence over the volatility of oil and gas prices, over the supply of oil and gas to countries, well, countries are going to look at cheaper renewables and say, why don't we just generate our energy locally and not have to rely upon that? It's very uncertain, and we have this potentially aggressive nation that controls the prices to a large degree. So forecasts that predict a shallow decline in oil and gas demand are based on unrealistic scenarios, and even a shallow decline spells trouble for global oil markets, as even a shallow decline can dump prices. A November 2025 report by the UK-based carbon tracker think tank shows a stark picture of the revenue losses provincial governments in Canada will face in the next decade as oil and gas demand dries up globally, by 85% in Alberta, by 72% in British Columbia, by 78% in Saskatchewan, and by nearly 100% in Newfoundland and Labrador. There is a lot of discussion about Equinor's proposed Bay du Nord oil project in Newfoundland and Labrador in the recordings. Sierra Club Canada questions the viability of Beta Nor based on research by multiple analysts. A separate report by the Australasian Center for Corporate Responsibility, or ACCR, assessed 10 major oil and gas companies, including Equinor, and found that global conventional oil and gas exploration is becoming less successful, more expensive, and is taking longer. Project execution, a critical driver of value, has typically been poor, with projects delivered late and over budget. The addressable market for oil and gas is diminishing as more sectors electrify. Despite this, the oil and gas majors are assuming that oil prices in 2030 will be around 17% higher than those implied by the forward curve. Despite the rhetoric on capital discipline, the oil and gas sector is continuing to bet on a future that may never arrive. As Sierra Club Canada's Newfoundland and Labrador Energy Transition and Advocacy Coordinator, Cassie Drodge, whose home is St. John's and who recently attended the Canadian Renewable Energy Association's Operators Summit, puts it, Equinor should be looking into offshore wind, not offshore oil. We are seeing other governments like the UK come out with ambitious renewable energy plans. When we talk about the future of employment in the province, we have to aim for where things are going to be with sectors like offshore wind that are a major focus of the summit that Cassie was at, and train people for that rapidly developing future. There is an entire showroom on offshore wind at that summit, and the possibilities are frankly excitingly overwhelming. In my work, we are seeing excitement across the province as well for these new solutions. And once again, that's Cassie Drodge, who works in Sierra Club Canada for energy transition work in Newfoundland and Labrador. In March 2024, Equinor's stock was actually downgraded, in part due to their continued consideration of Beta Nor. That's how bad the economics of the project are. Not having a plan is a plan to fail, as Gretchen Fitzgerald, our executive director, points out in the recordings you're about to listen to. There's also this weird moment in the recording where someone suggests that oil is more reliable because it's locally extracted in Newfoundland and Labrador as opposed to offshore wind, which would also be locally extracted, if you want to use the word extracted. I mean, they are aware, I hope, that oil has to be sold on the global market and that it's highly volatile in price because that volatility has already hit the province of Newfoundland and Labrador negatively several times. There are tons of wonderful stories about communities in Canada taking action both to electrify their communities, to build out battery storage, to build out solar, and to build out wind. Of course, some of that is happening nearby to Newfoundland and Labrador in Nova Scotia, but it's also happening across the country. And I encourage you to go check out a publication called The Energy Mix, which details these stories, many of them across Canada. Both wind and solar have already been shown to be highly reliable. They are the cheapest form of energy in Canada, and combined with batteries, they do not require backup base power. I will link to sources on the podcast description that will demonstrate this. The battery power and grid solutions for connecting renewables and making them reliable already exist. In fact, renewable energy is so reliable and so cheap that AI data centers in Europe are seeing gas power as uncompetitive in comparison, and they are actually picking to build near renewable sources and avoiding gas sources. As one energy analyst puts it, we don't anticipate Germany needing gas for AI specifically, especially since heavier gas reliance would just ramp up electricity prices and push these data centers away even more. So solar and wind globally are taking off. To quote CBC, renewables accounted for 34.3% of electricity generation globally in the first half of 2025, while coal accounted for 33.1%. It's the first time renewables have overtaken coal. The International Energy Agency showed in late 2025 that a supply boom in cheaper renewables will seal the end of the fossil fuel era. Low-cost renewable energy is soaring in China and Vietnam. Vietnam's wind and solar generation exceeds gas-powered fire generation. Demand is estimated to have already peaked in Europe and South Korea for liquefied natural gas. China has already surpassed its 2030 renewable energy ambitions. In fact, China installed more wind and solar power in a single year than the total amount of renewable energy currently operating in the United States. Canada actually risks losing out on the renewable future of energy and ending up reliant on countries like China if we don't build our own independent renewable supply chains. And that brings me to my point. Oil is a bubble, but the oil industry cannot admit that there is a bubble going on and that there's going to be a decline in demand, because to do that would be to burst the bubble. So if you can't expand your industry, but you also don't want to give away that it's a bubble, well, you blame regulation. because you say, well, these regulations, they're stopping us from expanding. And that allows you to sidestep the issue of future demand. And to give some context, regulations in Canada are actually already extremely relaxed, and that's in comparison to other jurisdictions like Alaska around offshore oil. Our government approved Beta Nord with a 16% chance of a serious oil spill, under a situation where it would likely take 18 to 36 days to get a well capping stack on site if there was a blowout. These are not strict conditions. These are not strong environmental regulations. Newfoundland and Labrador subsidizes oil and gas to the tune of millions of dollars. I'll link to that citation in the description. And Canada is spending 3 times more backing oil and gas than renewables, even though oil and gas is the energy of the past and renewables are the energy we need to be building out right now as rapidly as possible. I'm going to be honest. Listening to this conversation amongst the senators was quite frankly disappointing. If this is the level of discussion within the halls of power in Ottawa, then it is a vastly uninformed conversation based on oil and gas sector misinformation. Moreover, it is dangerous for Canada. The world is rapidly transitioning to renewables. Canada is at risk of falling behind. Our leaders need to wake up and get out of their bubble. Oil and gas interests lied to the public for decades on climate change, repeatedly. Our leaders are getting their information from those same oil and gas corporations anyway, and they seem to be trusting them completely. Our leaders are trusting liars while the world goes renewable. But what really gets me is the risk to Newfoundland and Labrador posed by leaders who are more interested in sounding popular by parroting oil and gas industry liars than they are in truthful pursuits of a beneficial future for the province. Here's the thing. Let's say for a second it was a debate. Even if there was a possibility that there was a 99% drop in revenue from oil and gas in the 2030s in Newfoundland and Labrador, wouldn't you want to at least have a backup plan? If you are a reasonable leader, would you not have a plan for a scenario like that, even if you only thought it was a possibility? When I read the news, I don't see government leaders with a plan. I see government leaders defending oil and gas lobbyists' talking points like it's a religion to them. I see them ignoring economic storms on the horizon because it's inconvenient to their faith in oil and gas. And for me, personally, this is problematic because I've spent a decade warning leaders in Newfoundland and Labrador that the provincial economy was overdependent on oil and gas, that we need renewable energy action. And the reason the province is in the situation it is in is because of successive governments failing to take action on that file. I do not want to see an economic collapse in Newfoundland and Labrador because of that. Now, the best time to act was yesterday, it was a decade ago, but the next best time to act is right now. And Equinor, by the way, does not do good oil spill modeling. It's actually something they're really bad at. If you can listen to our other podcast on Equinor's terrible oil spill modeling in Brazil, where they did not account for the tides. I'm going to say that again. They didn't account for the tides when doing the oil spill modeling for a project. As well, I'm not really sure why a senator thought it was important to comment on when the Mi'gmaw people settled in Newfoundland, but the date provided by the senator is wrong according to historical evidence. The Mi'gmaw were in Newfoundland a lot earlier than the 1880s. Anyway, here's the recordings. Make of them what you will. I'm personally scared for the future of the economy of Newfoundland and Labrador and all of Canada with what I heard. We in the climate movement need to be a lot louder on the economic futility of oil and gas because if people are not warned, if alternatives are not built, we are headed towards another codfish collapse situation. And that's not where any of us want the country to be.
I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Mi'gmawe'l Nation. My name is Joan Kingston. I'm a senator from New Brunswick and the chair of the Standing Senate Committee on Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources. And now I'd like to ask my colleagues to introduce themselves, beginning on my right.
Merci. José Werner du Québec.
Mary Coyle, Antigonish, Nova Scotia.
Suze Joas, Québec.
Todd Lewis, Saskatchewan.
Mary Jane McCollum, Treaty 10, Manitoba Region.
Daryl Fredhandler, Alberta.
David Wells, Newfoundland and Labrador.
Rosa Galvez, Québec.
Régent Aucoin, Nouvelle-Écosse.
Thank you, colleagues. I'd like us to welcome everyone with us today, as well as those listening online and at sencan.ca. Today, pursuant to the order of reference received from the Senate on October 8th, We are pursuing our study on the Newfoundland and Labrador's offshore petroleum industry. And today we're pleased to welcome on our first panel from the Sierra Club of Canada, Gretchen Fitzgerald, Executive Director by video conference, and with her, Shauna Kelly, Offshore Wind Coordinator, Newfoundland and Labrador, also by video conference. So welcome and thank you for being here with us tonight. And we're ready to hear your opening remarks, which will be followed by question period from the senators. Ms. Fitzgerald, I understand that you'll be giving the remarks, and so you now have the floor.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, and just really pleased to have Shauna with me, our Offshore Wind Coordinator, who's based in Burin, Newfoundland and Labrador. So yes, my name is Gretchen Fitzgerald. I'm Executive Director here at Sierra Club Canada. And we have been involved as an organization in offshore oil and gas issues for over 25 years. My main argument to you today is that continued reliance on the offshore oil and gas industry in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador places Newfoundland and Labrador and Canada at great risk. Risks from accelerated climate change impacts, risks from decreased global fossil fuel demand, risks from a failure to support communities in building out renewable energy sources, and at risk from placing precious ocean ecosystems and marine life in danger. We know from working with people and communities on the ground faced with growing climate disasters that they are ready and able to take on the challenge to become more resilient at this time of global rupture. According to Prime Minister Carney, nostalgia is not a strategy. We hope and recommend that the report from this committee confronts the risks of Newfoundland's continued oil and gas dependence head on. Images of Newfoundlanders storming a hotel ballroom when then Fisheries Minister John Crosbie announced the cod moratorium are not something we want to recreate. The heartbreak and lasting losses across the province, Canada, and the world should not be allowed to be repeated. And they need not be. Statistics provided to this committee from the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers show that oil exploration production in Newfoundland and Labrador is on a consistent decline. The Canadian Energy Regulators report, Canada's Energy Future, predicts rapid decline in offshore oil production in the coming decades. Analysis published in Nature in 2021 illustrates how the high cost of extraction of offshore oil and gas will make Newfoundland and Labrador's oil and gas less competitive, regardless of any understanding you may have about the emissions associated with its extraction. Meanwhile, renewable energy, such as wind, solar, and energy storage, is on the uprise. It will create job opportunities and affordable electricity for people in Atlantic Canada. Recent modeling conducted by Navius Research on the Wind West transmission line suggests that Nova Scotia PEI and New Brunswick could lower electricity rates at a time of an affordability crisis and boost GDP across these provinces by as much as $8 billion while achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Imagine if a province like Newfoundland and Labrador joined this party. Because Nova Scotia has embraced this opportunity and is moving towards Canada's first offshore wind developments, a company has raised its hand recently. Not only have they illustrated their interest in the offshore wind industry, they've created a memorandum of understanding with Nova Scotia's Community College to support a workforce to train people to work in this new energy industry. The provincial and federal governments have a regional assessment for offshore wind in Newfoundland and Labrador in their hands. The offshore regulator has indicated to this committee its readiness to engage in oversight of the offshore renewable energy space. We know Newfoundland and Labrador needs local, reliable energy sources such as wind, solar, and storage to ensure local people are safe going forward, both from growing climate change impacts like hurricanes and wildfires and storm events such as we've had over the last couple weeks, and from growing economic and geopolitical risks. Our work in Newfoundland with communities has shown people want to work together to build solutions that will make communities less vulnerable to climate change. With the existing oil platforms operating for decades into the future in Newfoundland, we do still need assurances that risks from accidents and spills has been addressed. And our experience in assessments of oil and gas projects in the past means we know this has not been the case. We will be leaving with this committee 5 recommendations we hope you will take up as recommendations yourselves. First, we want the federal, regional, Indigenous, and provincial governments to act immediately to create an agreement in Atlantic Canada to create an electricity grid that will be the backbone for local and national scale energy projects. We think the federal and provincial governments should act immediately to collaborate to develop upskilling and certification programs for people who now work in the offshore, so they are ready to seize these opportunities. And we further recommend that a portion of oil revenues be earmarked to future-proof Newfoundland and Labrador from the declines in fossil fuel demand. Thirdly, we believe that oil companies should take on the risk of offshore oil and gas development, not Canadians and not Newfoundland and Labradorians. There should be no further subsidies to this increasingly risky industry. And finally, we call on for an arm's length review of the impacts of oil and gas activity on ocean life and oil spill readiness for existing oil projects, and that the creation of science-based rules for oil and gas exploration and production and drilling be created as soon as possible so that ocean life remains protected. Thank you so much for this opportunity to address the committee, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Fitzgerald, for your opening statement. And I'd suggest that the first round, each member be allowed 5 minutes, including question and answer. If time permits, we'll have a second round. So we'd like to start with Senator Wells.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Fitzgerald, you had mentioned that Newfoundland and Labrador should wean itself off the dependency on oil and gas. I assume you're familiar with the economic situation in Newfoundland and Labrador. What would you think would be a good replacement for these jobs and the income for the province?
Yes, and I'm sure Shauna can back me up here, but I think it's two-pronged. I think there are communities we're working with now who want to get smaller scale energy built up so that they are more resilient in the face of hurricanes and wildfires and can start generating and benefiting small scale energy sources that are in line with their values and needs. And then bigger scale, there is massive potential for offshore wind. Peter Nicholson, a former deputy minister, has estimated that Canada's offshore wind potential in Eastern Canada is, on the scale of something that could power 6.5 million Canadian homes. Like, this is transformative. And seeing that we have a workforce that, I grew up in Newfoundland and Labrador. I know the ethos, the workforce is so capable, so able to adapt, but not seizing this opportunity and kind of hanging back when other Nova Scotia's coming to the table. It feels like a missed opportunity. So I feel there's an opportunity for smaller scale sources that can make communities resilient and generate revenue and jobs. But then there is this massive opportunity that's right there in front of us. And
thanks. So do you think these? So I'm not so much talking about the source of energy for smaller communities. I asked you about the economic opportunities. Obviously, the oil and gas sector in Newfoundland and Labrador employs thousands of people, generates billions of dollars, not just for the workers, but for their families and the communities in which they live. Not only the provincial tax base. That was not the essence of my question. That was my question. Could you answer that, please?
So are you talking revenue to government?
Revenue to the workers, to their families, to the communities in which they live, and the government.
Yes. So for the workers, if they are transferring their skills to new industries, they would be earning income for those jobs. For government, I think we want to have that conversation. I think there's places around the world where they've set up requirements that obviously this is a public resource if you want to think about wind in that way, and that they are required to contribute, companies that want to play in this field, similar to the offshore oil and gas industry, have to pay to play. So, I think we need to have those conversations with communities and stakeholder groups in Newfoundland and Labrador, what that would look like sensibly, and what a reasonable rate of return for, the ability to work in that sector. But yeah, Shauna, you might want to chip in a
Happy
bit
to
on
ask
this
the question.
Yeah.
International Energy Agency suggests that that peak oil, there'll be significant growth in oil production to 2050. Do you think, given that Newfoundland and Labrador's offshore oil sector is a low cost per barrel production, has direct access to the global markets by vessel, is well regulated, and commands the highest price as opposed to West Texas Intermediate or discounted prices in other parts of Canada. Do you think that, given that Newfoundland and Labrador's offshore oil and gas sector should not be participants in the continued growth of oil to at least 2050?
I think, Senator, that you have a time problem, both with regard to how long it takes to build up a new oil drilling program, which, history shows it could be 20 to 30 years. So we're in 2025 now. So there just isn't the time. And then there's the secondary argument I would make is that relative to other sources of oil globally and, articles published in Nature are peer-reviewed, other reports and the International Energy Agency analysis, some of that shows it'll be those lower cost oil sources, not oil drilled out of the dangerous waters of the North Atlantic that are going to compete with declining, softening demand. And I don't think it's wise, regardless if you believe my two arguments there, the having all our eggs in one basket at a time of global rupture is not wise.
Question, Chair. Thank you. We heard from other witnesses during this study that the decline in bids for the offshore was due to regulatory burden and not demand, or certainly not supply. What's your comment on this?
I think it's false.
From our industry experts that testified at committee?
Well, name me an industry expert that likes a regulation. No, I think Newfoundland and Labrador has participated in international climate change conferences to promote oil and gas. There's not a place where this industry is not being promoted. There is the reason people are not bidding is because the money is not there and they don't see it.
Thank you.
Senator Coyle.
Thank you. Welcome to our witnesses today. Thank you for your testimony. It's my first day on this study, so I'm catching up. But I appreciated the question of my colleague, and I think the economic one is a serious one, and you have addressed it in a different way in terms of the risks of putting the eggs in this basket for the long term. I'm curious, though, to build on my colleague's question about beyond the energy supply for the province and for the region. I'm very excited as a Nova Scotian to see the development of wind in my own province. One of the things that we're also doing in Nova Scotia, which is meeting with some controversy, is looking at wind-powered hydrogen for export. And I know this has been looked at for Newfoundland and Labrador. Is that something that you or your colleague could comment on in terms of a possible export market to contribute to the Newfoundland economy?
Yeah, Shauna, did you want to take this one?
And brief comment, maybe you can jump in on that, Gretchen, as well. Yeah, I think it's been explored in Newfoundland and Labrador, and what we've seen recently is that companies are drawing back from that initial proposal because the market has not materialized for hydrogen. So I would recognize that in this current moment, it is not a viable option for Newfoundland and Labrador to be pursuing hydrogen further economically. Gretchen?
Sorry.
Yeah, and just to
Go
add to
ahead.
that, if we're talking about how to prioritize such a beautiful and massive resource like offshore wind, yeah, I think the primary thing should be, particularly right now, is creating energy security and affordability for Canadians. So that would be the primary use. And if hydrogen can be done safely and without creating more emissions, that might be a secondary output, but it shouldn't be the primary reason why we're investing.
Okay, thank you for that. I am curious then, in terms of let's get back to the regulators question. You know, here we are at this moment. I don't think anybody's going to argue that we're going to be living with oil and gas forever and ever as an industry. There are arguments about the timing of that, and we've heard different sides of that, and you've cited some very important sources. So the regulators, and we're looking at Newfoundland and Labrador here, dealing with, it's real. The economic reliance on oil and gas in Labrador right now is absolutely real, okay? So how would you see our federal regulators balancing that short-term economic reliance, you know, food on the table reality of Newfoundlanders right now, on that offshore oil with Canada's long-term climate commitments and our net zero obligations, which we absolutely have to get to. And you yourself have made a very strong case, and it's a no-brainer, frankly. We have to get to meet our net zero commitments, as do other countries around the world, in order to avert, you know, the disasters that you have spoken to. So how do you see our federal regulators balancing that?
Yeah, and I'm not sure it would be the job of the regulators, which are, you know, focused on the industries that they're regulating, but definitely I would see political leaders. There's a real opportunity here to create a plan of transition. And there's been different bodies, you know, similar to how we transitioned off of coal nationally. You know, different bodies could be created and activated to work quickly to create that plan. And it's very clear that as production has declined, so have revenues to the provincial government in Newfoundland and Labrador. So, you know, how can that revenue be compensated for by building up other industries such as offshore wind? That is something that this committee, if you could kick off that conversation, it would be wonderful. And I think there is a potential, but not having a plan is a plan to fail. And that's what I'm seeing right now.
Hear you. So at the policy level, yes, that's. Are you also? You've said that there should be absolutely no more financial inducements or supports to the offshore oil. In fact, they should be creating funds, you know, to deal with their impacts, etc. What do you see the federal government doing to support offshore wind? To encourage it to really flourish in a place like Newfoundland and Labrador?
Yeah, I mean, three things. I mean, the convening power to get everyone to the table to talk about transmission links, including Indigenous partners, but of course the provinces. You know, get some folks on the dance floor and get them to dance. Secondarily, I think the federal government has a unique role with regard to relationships with Indigenous communities and leaders, and I think there's something that the federal government could be doing there. And thirdly, of course, money. There's a lot of talk of projects of national interest. I cannot think of a project that would be more transformative in a positive way than investing in this. And I think talking and thinking seriously about that kind of investment. Your previous question was about revenues and displacement of revenues from declining royalties from the offshore. You know, beginning and instigating that level of investment in this opportunity is the third thing the federal government could be doing right now.
Thank you. Okay. Senator Galvez.
Second.
Merci beaucoup de votre présence aujourd'hui pour répondre.
Thank you for being here today to answer our questions. Thank you very much.
Follow the history of the oil offshore industry in Newfoundland, but you seem to know a lot also of renewable energy. So I would like to use and pick up your brain to compare and to see advantages and disadvantages. And as I think you have grasped, that the interest in this committee is also very much directed to the economy impact, So we have our Prime Minister going, visiting many places looking for new markets. And he is saying that we need to build nation-building projects, and that everybody seems to agree that we have to increase competitiveness and innovation and more creativity. And then for the renewable energy, last year was 2.1 trillion of investments, where less than 0.5 came to Canada. I think that tells a lot. So my question is, if we are looking for competitiveness and we are looking for innovation, and should we look to the in decline industry, or should we look into the one that you are saying there is a big opportunity and this is a big, there is a race and we are late to the party, and but also if you can comment on the issue that the difference between exporting raw material, like we have been doing all the time, and adding value to different products, different materials that we export. Thank you so much.
Yes, and thank you for that question. And those advantages and disadvantages make up a good part of what we do when we think about climate change and centering nature in our society at Sierra Club. And I think the interesting thing about renewable energy is it's not one and done. It'll be an ongoing economic engine for the country. Once those oil and gas resources are extracted, those public benefits are gone. And unfortunately, Canada did not create an oil fund similar to Norway so that future generations would benefit from those revenues. That ship has sailed, but there is a new ship on the horizon, which is such a wonderful thing to think about in this moment. So definitely there's advantages with regard to just ongoing revenue, ongoing jobs, ongoing energy security, and reduced energy rates. These are cheaper energy sources for people, so their actual electricity bills will go down. So those are some of the advantages. In terms of sort of local industries and local innovation, Nova Scotia is home to some great work on energy storage. Done correctly, we could be working on ways to recycle oil rigs. Believe it or not, this is being done in Norway, I hear, to make wind turbines. There's ways that we can be building out our expertise using our know-how and resources, so that we are actually, building some of these products and innovating. And again, keeping that know-how, that knowledge here in Canada, I think it's a benefit that we should be seizing as well. So that this is a time of change, and I think individual people and communities recognize that, but they also, in my experience, want to participate in the solutions, and that's what's going to get us through. And I think there's a real opportunity to invest in that type of innovation and within the country, technological advancement and scientific advancement, so that we are building some of these new energy sources here at home.
So much.
I don't know, Shauna, if you have further.
Oh, I still have
Yes. Okay. Senator McCallum.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. I wanted to, the first question I have is looking at how long is it going to take to set up the solar and wind energy so we can see the reality, because right now we have nothing. And when we did C49, they told us it would be 10 years. So you're making a presentation on, well, this is going to be possible, and trying to get rid of the only dependable source of energy that we have. And you put electricity as a solution. Well, I work with hydro-impacted communities, and it is not clean, nor is it green. And it produces a lot of toxins. It's not reliable. During Christmas in northern Manitoba, Cross Lake, the hydro went down for 5 days in -40 weather. And they were told by the community, this is going to happen again. They did nothing. So I look at the toxins, I look at the land displacement, what it's done to First Nations. So, and then you look at Labrador, you look at all the electrical Site C dam. Well, they're not producing the electricity that everyone proclaims is here. So when we look at what you're proposing, shouldn't we see how reliable wind source and electric grid are before you place them as a replacement for oil and gas? And how do you address the group of people that drive the dependence in oil and gas, which is Canadians? They do the driving, and combustion is one of the highest gas emissions, and nothing has been done about it. So I can't rely on offshore, on solar and wind. So how long will it take to come up so we can see the reality? And okay.
Yes, and thank you for that question. And I feel the frustration as well that this has not been stood up faster. Sierra Club shares your concerns about mega hydro, both its impacts on communities, its impact on river ecosystems, and the toxins that are freed up when we flood land. So with regard to timeline and standing up new energy resources, we're working with folks in Port aux Basques, and we hope to get some solar panels up, this year. So scale matters, and we know communities in Newfoundland and in Labrador in particular have stood up solar to decrease reliance on diesel, for instance. So, and a wind turbine can go up in a year or two if there's community consent and will to do it. The scale of offshore wind means that, we are talking several years, perhaps a decade, correct me if I'm wrong, Shauna, before we see it stood up. And by stood up, I mean stood up with community consent, buy-in, and done correctly. So it depends on scale, but smaller scale, we could do tomorrow. Who's stopping us? Usually it's, corporate power from the oil and gas sector, let's be honest. So that's why there's been such a delay in the uptake of this. It doesn't matter now because the price has gone down so much without even factoring in the climate impacts that the fossil fuel industry is responsible for. The price alone at the meter is lower. So they're out competing, and we'll be submitting studies to this report showing how that surge is happening. And it's just going to displace fossil fuels, which is wonderful. But yeah, smaller scale, we can do it now. Let's do it. Let's not let the oil industry stop us. And then with regard to the reliability for, what if the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine? That's where energy storage comes in, and having investments in a grid, which we are recommending this committee recommend in its report. there's been little advancements in our electricity grids, since, basically Edison invented the light bulb. Like, we can be doing more to be shunting energy around and being smart about it, and taking things up. And I think the third part of your question had to do with individual responsibility. And as that is something I think we all should be proponents of, whether it's when there is a storm, as there have been storms in the last couple of weeks in Atlantic Canada, and there is a potential that your neighboring province is going to run out of energy. And actually, on Newfoundland, it was because of a hydro dam going down, and there was ice, and it couldn't function. And so electrons were coming from Nova Scotia over to Newfoundland and Labrador. Even so, there was rolling brownouts, is my understanding. We need to get better ourselves at being, being more conscious of our energy use, investing in energy efficiency so that people, particularly low-income folks who are, paying proportionally so much higher for these energy bills, have safer, secure homes in those times of cold, which we experience. And, so we're more efficient. And with regard to the cars and the transportation use, again, it's investing in electric vehicles that will rely on renewable energy from the grid.
Thank you.
That's what going to drive that. But individuals, it's still so important, and that's what good neighbors do.
Senator Lewis.
Yeah, I question the perception that oil and gas can't work at the same time as renewable energy. I come from a jurisdiction in Saskatchewan, and even myself personally, I've been, as a landowner in Saskatchewan, I've been approached by a proponent that wants to put up a wind farm with certain, if they were able to get a contract to supply power to the provincial power authority. And never once have I ever heard them say we need to shut down all the oil and gas in Saskatchewan before we can build a windmill. So why can't we have both? It would seem to me that the new energy sources like windmill are, as we transition into that, that's fine. But to say that the oil and gas industry in Newfoundland should be shut down and that it's in the way of wind farms, I just don't see the connection. And further to that, I mean, it'd be nice if the people in those communities that rely on oil and gas so much for as an economic driver, would be able to afford the new energy that's coming from these wind farms as it's being made.
Yeah, and if that's the perception I've created, that the two can't coexist, that is not what I am contending. And there are rigs out there, and I anticipate they will be out there for the next, 2 decades, I think, is what the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers presentation to the committee suggested. I think
cleared that up. Thank you. But I've got another. I've got another question just about
this. If I could answer the question, this needs to be a priority, and that's not what I'm seeing.
Okay, thank you.
Do you understand? So for government, with regard to subsidies, they should be going to renewable energy sources of the future and getting, yes, like you say, for those workers, getting them affordable energy in their homes or getting them upskilled so that they can be part of this future.
I think
Senator Lewis has some more points to make.
I think in a jurisdiction like Saskatchewan, is, their experience there, they've got a common power provider across the whole province. Very comparable to Newfoundland, small population, large areas to provide power to. And their experience with wind power and solar panels is that they're great, but if you are looking to increase your power needs, which I mean, as we go forward in the new economy, everybody's going to be using more electricity. For every kilowatt generated by either solar or wind, you need backup as a base power. And that's reality, because, we just recently went through a 40 below period where, weather was that cold for, I think it was 10 days in a row. Virtually from the wind farms and solar panel, production goes down to almost zero. So you have to have backup power that's base power based either on oil and gas or natural gas or hydro, but you've got to have that base power to provide the power when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. And that, we can say that isn't something, but it is reality when you're talking about energy production from these sources. So it's a nice source to add to our power grids. But right now, with the available technology, you mentioned batteries, but we're a long way away from being able to, have a battery system and a power system and a grid that would support using solar and wind as base power.
Well, I would argue that that's not the case, and we're actually having that debate right here in Atlantic Canada right now with proposed new expensive gas plants. And there is a player in the region who is contending that their storage option would be more reliable in terms of cost, because we know if we're going to do fossil fuels, it's going to fluctuate with the market, but overall more affordable. So I think we are there. And just to go back to Rosa Galvez's question, to me, it's about investing and prioritizing those types of innovations locally to create that reliability, because I completely agree we need that reliability. But the technology is there, the cost is there, and that's where it comes back to my argument about priority setting and listening to different players.
Experts in Western Canada and the people that are in charge and it's their duty to provide power haven't found that. And it'll be interesting as time goes on, but we're certainly not seeing that in jurisdiction like Saskatchewan. That technology does not exist. And with the weather conditions we have and the variability in temperatures, minus 40 in the winter and plus 40 in the summer, battery power as it sits right now is very questionable.
Yes, and I would not question your experience in your home province, but I would ask you to look for independent research on that, aside from your utility.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Chair. Do you understand French? Oh, we have the interpretation a little, but you have the interpretation. Very well. I would like to turn back to the fact that we have heard some witnesses, for example, saying that the demand for oil or for fossil fuels will change, but it's not going to be decreasing as much as had been suggested in the initial studies or observations, because there's going to be a high demand for energy, for example, for all of the IT or data centers. The technology will need other sources of products derived from hydrocarbons. So I would like to bring the discussion back. I understand your concern and your position as regards renewable energy, but we have examined fossil fuels and the possibility of offshore operations. And there has been a study in 2023 by Fisheries and Oceans, and I'm sure you've seen it. And there was even a quote from Minister Guilbeault at the time who said that it was nevertheless possible to have those operations, and that there was an environmental study that was done, and that with fairly strict conditions, we could move forward with those operations. So I'd like to hear you briefly on that, because after that I have a second question.
And I want to make sure I understand the question. So are you speaking with regard to the Bay du Nord project and the environmental assessment of that? Yes. And we challenge, of course, the findings of that assessment, and even the Department of Fisheries and Oceans report on that, which was only released after the assessment was complete, showed that there were impacts with regard to oil spills that were the risk there was underestimated drastically. Equinor contended it was a low risk, and in fact, over the lifetime of the project, it's a 16% risk, which is not low in any scientific interpretation. And we're talking some of the most dangerous ocean waters in the world that have ice flows going through them, icebergs going through them at times. So, and the economic, the global consequences of a massive spill out there that could go on for over a month without any hope of stopping oil spill, it would be catastrophic. to our reputation, to ocean industries, and of course to ocean life, whales, fish, deep sea corals. That report also showed that the long-term effects of this project on sensitive ocean life, regardless of a massive spill, were underestimated, and those vulnerable ocean ecosystems will be damaged permanently. Permanently. This was not included in the assessment of that project. Okay? So when people talk about how overregulated this industry is, it infuriates me, frankly. So,
c'est ça.
and then, okay. So, but your second question is about, I think, how can we study different energy sources better? Is that, I just want to make sure I understand the question.
I wanted to focus on the study on hydrocarbons and on the Bay du Nord project. But one thing that came out, and I understand that that's your position on the project, but from my part, as regards the information I've received and that I have been able to read today, the operation of the Bay du Nord project would create a lot less environmental impact. I understand your remarks regarding the possibility of a spill, but the emissions, the average emissions would be lower, much lower than the Alberta oil sands. The only question I'd like you to respond to is, if it moves forward, if the project goes ahead, I understand the Sierra Club's position that perhaps we ought not to go that way, but we still need the oil industry. If the project moves forward, isn't it better than exploiting the oil sands, which are more harmful to the environment?
Yeah, I mean, the global scientific consensus is and has been for many years that no new oil projects are compatible with a safe climate going forward. So no, the Bay du Nord project is not safe. It is not what's needed now.
I was asking, as compared to the oil sands, if you could make the comparison. I'm sure that you have data. Does it cause lower emissions? Is it less harmful to the environment?
At the extraction phase, relative to extracting oil sands oil, it would be lower. However, the majority of the emissions associated with the project are from, of course, burning the fuel extracted. And the emissions from that will be significant, you know.
Et comme comité, on comprend ça.
As a committee, we understand that.
Alternatives such as offshore wind that are here now and we need to start investing in.
Je suis d'accord, mais
I agree, but we have a focus on something different today in this context. Thank you. Thank you.
I found your opening remarks quite alarming because you spoke solely of risks and the downside associated with offshore Newfoundland. And I believe that since the early 90s, this has been the savior of the Newfoundland economy, and I'm quite pleased to see the good that's come to Newfoundland from the offshore development. Having said that, can we revisit all the negatives, and do you see any positives to Newfoundland and the offshore oil production? And I'm not asking for global comparatives, I'm asking to Newfoundland.
I mean, I don't think it can be argued that the revenue has been helpful. And what I'm arguing is that the revenue is going to dry up, and it's time to face the music.
We all have different crystal balls on that, but I don't see, when we start talking to move on about wind and solar in the face of the fog in Newfoundland that exists from time to time, and other renewables, that those are going to generate revenue for the economy as opposed to maybe sustenance for small communities from time to time. Do you have any studies that you can refer me to that show that this is net surplus revenue that would flow to the government operating budget from year to year that Newfoundlanders could rely on to have a sustainable economy over time?
Yeah, and perhaps I can get Shauna to answer that, because we are looking around the world to see what benefits could flow from something like
For Newfoundlanders. I'm concerned about the future of Newfoundlanders and that there'd be something that is there for them in the future.
Yes, and we certainly share that concern and are very concerned that, like with the cod fishery, there will be no plan until it's too late.
But so right now, you can't point me to studies that show surplus revenue type offshore wind or solar, or even maybe nuclear.
Well, I'll get Shauna.
It's in there someplace.
I would say at this point in time, we don't have that current study for Newfoundland and Labrador specifically, but for our neighbors in Atlantic Canada, for Nova Scotia, for PEI, and for New Brunswick, the most recent study that we've seen did project as much as $8 billion to boost GDP. So that does exist here in Atlantic Canada.
You can find it to Newfoundland because I'm a little, I understand that there's, always talk about a regional grid, but, we all know that Newfoundland is far removed from the maritime provinces as much as it's part of the Atlantic provinces, and it's not so easy, that kind of infrastructure. So I want Newfoundland to be sustainable on its own. Go ahead, if you can tell me about studies that show that this is going to lead to a sustainable economy.
Yeah, I would say to a specific study, we don't currently have that, but I would also bring forward that I share the concern of wanting to see Newfoundland as an island have reliable and affordable energy. However, we currently do rely on Labrador, and in our most recent storm, relied on Nova Scotia for that energy. So while we may seem an island removed, we are actually already connected, and that's possible to expand and enhance that for not only the island of Newfoundland and Labrador, but all of Atlantic Canada by investing in transmission of renewable energy now.
And might I assume that you seem to be warm and cozy where you are, and I'm assuming you're in Newfoundland, that you're not using hydrocarbons to stay warm?
You would be correct. I do have a heat pump and electric baseboard heating.
Ms. Fitzgerald?
Sorry?
How are you staying warm indoors there?
Similarly, we have solar panels on the roof and a heat pump. Unfortunately, Nova Scotia hasn't moved as rapidly to get off coal and gas as Newfoundland and Labrador. Primarily we are shifting toward greater wind sources in Nova Scotia. So as that
Nova Scotia, then you're not in Newfoundland.
Yes, I'm based in Nova Scotia.
Okay.
Thank you. Senator Yuans.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Fitzgerald, for your remarks. You contend that it would be more judicious to reorient investments toward wind energy and other sources of energy, and you gave a certain time period over the next 2 years. And you also stated that offshore exploitation is no longer economically viable. According to you, what would be the main indicator that ought to persuade decision makers to turn the page?
And just to say for major offshore wind development, we're predicting more. We would see that be more like a 7 to 10 year build out. But for smaller scale, it can happen very quickly. Energy sources and storage. For me, as a mom, frankly, the biggest indicator is looking in my kids' eyes. And it is scary to think that we have an opportunity to do better and we're potentially not going to seize it. The second thing is looking around and seeing communities impacted by wildfires, by hurricanes, by storm events increased unpredictably, by lack of ice in places like Labrador in the winter, and knowing the science shows that every bit of climate pollution we prevent will save lives, will save communities, will save money, and will create a more secure future for all. And I guess the third thing, and this is why I'm more hopeful than when the cod fishery collapsed, is we have such a beautiful opportunity for clean healthy energy sources that are affordable for people. There was no replacing the codfish and its cultural and ecological importance. Here, we have a positive opportunity. We need leaders such as yourselves to see that, to seize it, to prioritize it. I am begging you, as a mother, to take on this challenge. We may not have an opportunity like this again, ever. Please seize it.
Merci, Madame Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Ms. Fitzgerald. I hope I'll ask a less emotional question. How do you assess the government's capacity, the different levels of government that you mentioned, to coordinate their efforts toward the transition, as well as to maintain the operations underway in order to have the local economy continue?
Yeah, and as I mentioned in some of my answers, I think there is a model for this when we built down coal. So, and there are, sustainable jobs, there were, processes that have been created, and I think they just need to be, put on steroids, however you want to put it. They just need to be built up quickly. This is a moment of global rupture. This is a moment when people are hungering for solutions, for action, for tangible, real things to happen to protect them. So, yeah, I think building up a kind of task force kind of idea that would, upskill people, put resources, put money into the clean energy future and energy security. And I will mention here the Youth Climate Corps, which was funded to a very small degree, $40 million in the last budget. But let's get that out there. Let's get young people involved. Let's enhance the budget item for that. But, let's get a youth, engage the youth as well early, and give them the skills and resources they need to really take part. I mean, I think there's a lot of hopelessness out there, and one way you deal with hopelessness is by taking action. And I think we have some great opportunities to do that by working together and perhaps modeling on the coal sort of task force idea.
Merci. Merci.
Merci. We don't have very many minutes left, and we have 4 speakers, beginning with Senator Coyle. So I'd just like to ask everybody to be brief, 1 to 2 minutes tops for question and answer.
First of all, I just want to sincerely thank our witnesses for all of your hard work. It's very much appreciated, and I hope you're feeling some appreciation from this group, not just for your testimony today, but for everything that you are doing. I'm curious. You mentioned the issue of the projects of national interest that Canada is looking at here. For projects of national interest, we need proponents. And I'm curious, in terms of the offshore wind that we're talking about as a possibility for Newfoundland and Labrador, do you know of proponents, companies, communities, others that are interested in coming together to be a proponent for this type of new industry?
Yeah, I can speak to that one a bit. I would say specific to Newfoundland and Labrador, we're not aware of those proponents because the call to say that we are moving towards offshore wind has not happened here. For Nova Scotia, where they did just just close their pre-qualification, those results aren't public, but there was, as Gretchen mentioned, 2 companies in a joint venture, one from France and one from South Korea, that did announce that they did put in for pre-qualification and have already taken steps to start building out their benefits agreements locally, including training programs for Nova Scotians.
Thank you.
Senator Galvez.
So it is easy to get very emotional, and I appreciate that. And me too, I'm a grandmother of 4, and so the future, it's very important for me, not for my grandchildren. And so to calm me down, I go always to data and to technical aspects. And so I have participated in many environmental impact assessment of energy project, and I have studied many. And so at the very beginning of an impact assessment, we ask this question: why do we need this project? Is it to create an economy, create jobs because some politician wants to get votes? Or do we have an energy need in the community? So for me, up to now, when we talk about this project, I really don't know. What is the ultimate purpose? Is it to create revenues for the province? If it's that, well, then there are many other ways of creating that. Is it to provide with energy capacity that is not there? Well, now there is many other ways of producing that. Is it to create jobs so somebody wins an election? So what is your opinion on that? Because my colleague is right. We are talking about these specific new oil ring expansion of the oil in Newfoundland.
Yeah, and excuse me for getting emotional.
Say that for you to ask excuses.
Thank you for your understanding. I find it specific to impact assessment, often those statements about the need for the project tend to be very self-referential. So usually it's the proponent saying, we need this project because we need this project because, there is no real valid justification. I think for Newfoundland and Labrador, obviously it has been the need to fill the gap that was created when the cod fishery collapsed, and the creation of jobs and royalties. I guess what we're trying to argue for this committee is that those jobs and those revenues are declining, and yet there is another industry waiting in the wings, and it does need focus. It does need consistent, attention from elected leaders. And yes, it may, when it comes to the grid, there may need to be public investments. There could even be public joint ownership of some of these wind projects. That is for the people of Newfoundland and Labrador and communities to discuss, and we hope to be having those conversations with them in the year ahead. And I hope the government and yourselves will engage in those conversations too. But when you talk about the benefits for renewable energy sources, it's very clear there's many other co-benefits aside from potential profits to a proponent. It's not that self-referential, we need this project because we need to profit from this project, thank you very much. The benefits are, in addition to jobs, potential revenue for government, it is helping participate in the climate solutions, which I think in terms of Canadian resilience, Canadian sovereignty, Canadian patriotism, I think could be very significant. It's creating energy security for Canada. It is combating increasing climate impacts, which I think we all know are increasing. So there's so many other co-benefits that need could be easily justified, and justified including those benefits, not just benefits to proponents.
Thank you. We've almost run out of time, but to give the last question to Senator Wells.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks again, witnesses. So you had mentioned, Ms. Fitzgerald, about community consent. In Newfoundland and Labrador, I'm aware that there's quite a large percentage of Newfoundlanders and Labradorians give consent to the oil and gas sector. And in Germany, of course, there was no community consent for nuclear, so they banned it. Given that renewables as a global supply of electricity amount to less than 5%, and petroleum amounts to around 60%, my question is about the trend lines and the trend lines for the near future. One of the first things that Ms. Kelly said in her testimony was that there's wind hydrogen is not a viable alternative. Given that Prime Minister Carney will today announce the dropping of the EV mandate and your comments that EV use will drive growth, are you concerned about the trend lines of increased petroleum as outlined, or as detailed, sorry, not outlined, as detailed by the International Energy Agency, growth to 2050, and the reduction in things like nuclear in the economic engine of Europe, in Germany, and now in Canada with the dropping of the EV mandate and the failure of the battery plants funding having moved to the U.S.?
To answer your question, no. Of course, I wish those things were not happening, but some of the information we'll be submitting to the committee includes information about the projected surge in global power. They're saying that wind and solar alone are predicted to account for 32% of global power by 2030, surging to over half by 2040. Even in the United States, where I think we know the federal administration, at least, is pushing back on climate action and actively dismantling, efforts to deal with climate change, wind and solar outpaced coal on the grid. So why is this happening? It's because these are cheaper energy sources. Solar, wind, storage are cheaper than their fossil fuel alternatives. So we have that happening. And then I think, and I do agree with Prime Minister Carney as to some degree in his speech in Davos when he's talking about collections of, coalitions of the willing, basically, being so important right now. And the countries that Canada will be, I predict, looking to collaborate with, such as China, such as potentially South Korea, which is the home of one of the companies that wants to operate here in the offshore in Nova Scotia, such as the European bloc. Some of those countries are surging ahead on climate action themselves, whether it's EVs, whether it's renewables. So if we want to be part of those coalitions of the willing, and in the global south, where the climate impacts are so much more staggering and unjust, if we want to be working with those folks, I think being active in this space is going to be more important than ever.
Thank you, Ms. Fitzgerald. We've come to the end of our time together, but I'd like to thank both you and Ms. Kelly for being here with us today. We'll be going on to our second panel, so we'll take just a short switch over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you, Senators. And we'll be submitting some information to hopefully support our arguments and any questions we couldn't answer adequately today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I would like to welcome our second panel now. So from Mi'gmawe'l Tplu'taqnn, we have Derek Simon, who is legal counsel by video conference, Dean Vicker, executive director by video conference. And so Mr. Vicker and Mr. Simon, welcome, and thank you for being with us tonight. You have 5 minutes to make an opening remarks, after which we'll move on to a question and answer session with the senators. So, Mr. Vicker, you may proceed with your opening remarks, followed by Mr. Simon.
Thank you so much, Senator Kingston, and great to see you once again. And it was a pleasure of breaking some bread with you at the table last week. Wilik Shipugum Sidwan, Nindali was Dean Miguel, Wigil Listagush, Wiltazidan Dobedayog, Akwal Lagunum Sidwan. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dean Vicker. I'm the executive director here at MTI. MTI is a not-for-profit organization created by the 9 Mi'gmaw First Nations in New Brunswick, and we represent 8 communities on consultation matters. Its objectives include promoting and supporting the recognition, affirmation, and implementation of Aboriginal and treaty rights and the right of self-determination of our nations. I'm happy to explain to you why MTI joined environmental groups to launch a legal challenge against the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada approval of the $16 billion Baie du Nord oil and gas project. First, you must understand, as Ilnu or Mi'gmaw, the cultural significance of Blumu, which is salmon. We are salmon, and our traditional fishing practices must guide our actions. Mi'gmawe'l territory extends throughout Atlantic Canada. Even activity outside of New Brunswick can have impacts on the ability of the Mi'gmawe'l to carry on our rights. The project area is essential for the migration route of Atlantic salmon, which we already recognize as a species at risk and categorized as being in the critical zone by Fisheries and Oceans Canada. A single oil spill could decimate species that migrate through the spill area. We have a profound responsibility to protect the salmon, other species, and habitats that are essential to maintaining a balanced marine ecosystem for future generations. We could and cannot ignore the threat this project could have on the salmon and other marine species. We were not given the opportunity to have our concerns conveyed in the assessment of this project. So we felt we had no choice but to take a stand and join the Sierra Club and Eco-Justice into legal action for the following reasons. There was a lack of meaningful consultation with our communities on this project. The federal government ignored their constitutional responsibility to meaningfully consult with our Indigenous nations. The real potential for negative environmental effects, especially the threat of oil spills. And finally, the real threat on marine life, in particular, blumel or salmon, this project could cause. These concerns, of course, remain today. We will do whatever we can to protect the waters and species that are culturally significant to our nations. I want to be clear that we are not against economic development. We just want to make sure it is done responsibly and in a sustainable manner. I look forward to discussing this in more detail throughout the session, and my colleague Derek Simon here will provide more detail on the flawed consultation process. Thank you so much. Thank you for hearing me, and I turn to Derek.
Great. Derek Simon, Good morning, Senators. My name is Derek Simon. I'm legal counsel to Mi'gmawe'l Tplu'taqnn. The flawed consultation process undertaken by the federal government in this case involved rushed timelines, inadequate funding, and significant problems with how project impacts were scoped. So MTI communities located in New Brunswick were initially scoped out of the impact assessment for oil and gas projects in eastern Newfoundland. However, MTI provided Indigenous knowledge regarding the migratory routes for salmon, which was subsequently confirmed by DFO, and ultimately CM scoped MTI communities into the impact assessment. However, there were still concerns about how activities with significant potential impacts on Mi'gmawe'l rights were scoped out of the process and the failure to meaningfully include Indigenous knowledge, or IK. For the Bay du Nord project, SIA chose to scope marine shipping out of the impact assessment, despite clear evidence it is a direct result of the project and should be included in any impact assessment. Because of this decision, the Mi'gmawe'l were never actually consulted about the impacts of marine shipping on Mi'gmawe'l rights. While Equinor Canada has pledged to support the Environmental Studies Research Fund to study Atlantic salmon migration, these studies should have been initiated well before any decisions regarding the environmental assessment were made and should have been informed by Indigenous knowledge. The lack of meaningful participation in the consultation process means the main concerns identified by the Mi'gmawe'l were not addressed. Fortunately, this problem has a solution. MTI has adopted the Mi'gmawe'l Rights Impact Assessment, which is a rigorous Indigenous-led process for determining the impact of any project on Mi'gmawe'l rights. Coupled with MTI's IK research process, it provides clear, evidence-based decisions regarding project impacts on Mi'gmawe'l rights, which in turn inform the duty to consult process. We strongly encourage the committee to encourage the Crown and proponents to recognize Indigenous-led impact assessment processes and Indigenous knowledge. And we look forward to answering any questions the senators may have.
We'll begin with the questioning, about 4 minutes for question and answer, beginning with Senator Wells.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for appearing. You're based in New Brunswick, representing Mi'gmawe'l bands in New Brunswick. Can you give me can you help me understand how what the link is to offshore oil and gas development in Newfoundland from the New Brunswick bands? You're on mute, Mr. Vicar.
Apologize for that. Thank you for the question, Senator Wells. Well, as I previously stated, the migratory pattern of salmon, could be and potentially decimated if there is an oil spill. The migratory pattern is well within our Indigenous knowledge, and the idea that this could be impacted has a profound impact, and will have a profound impact on our existence as a people. We rightfully or wrongfully, and many would argue this, we refer to ourselves as Mi'gmaw, but the more adept term would be Ilnu in our language. Ilnu means that we're from this from the earth, from the water. And, we are here because of salmon, and, not even to discuss the other species, but specifically, and to be more of a direct response to your question, that's indeed what it would be, the potential impact to our salmon.
I'd emphasize as well, Senator, that Mi'gmaw territory extends throughout Atlantic Canada, including portions of Newfoundland, and that most Mi'gmaw people have ties to all parts of the territory. When we chose to involve our MTI chose to get involved in the judicial review, we reached out to the cousins and to the relatives in Newfoundland, spoke to the folks in Conn River, and because it's their district, and said that we were planning on involving MTI in this challenge, and they were fine with that. They understood the need as well to protect the territory, and as my colleague Mr. Vicaire emphasized, migratory patterns of species that people depend on don't recognize our colonial or provincial boundaries. They migrate where they're going to migrate, and the salmon do go through that area. In addition, a number of our communities fish in areas that are fairly proximate to the oil and gas development, and so there were a number of potential impacts on the rights of communities in New Brunswick, and it's a comment on how interconnected the territory and the people really are.
Okay, thanks. I will note that the Mi'gmaw didn't come to Newfoundland until the 1880s. We had Chief Benoit from Mi'gmawe'l First Nation in Conn River as one of our witnesses last month, and he didn't mention this at all. Was Mi'gmawe'l part of the MTI submission?
They were not, but again, we spoke to Mi'gmawe'l before involving ourselves in the process. I do feel a need to address the comment that the Mi'gmaw did not arrive in Newfoundland until the 1880s. I recognize that that is something that was taught in schools in Newfoundland and Labrador for a long time. I also recognize that the current historical scholarship and Indigenous knowledge entirely discredits that claim. There are areas in Western Newfoundland with names like Weegamoon Point, with Mi'gmaw place names, and when you look at the historical records, and the first Europeans to show up talk about seeing Mi'gmaw villages in Western Newfoundland, the evidence is there, as well as in the oral history, that the Mi'gmaw occupied Western Newfoundland long before Europeans arrived. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks for that. I was just speaking about the Mi'gmaw and Mi'gmawe'l. So the issues from MTI are more about the consultation process as opposed to specifically oil and gas development. Would that be accurate?
I'll defer to my colleague. I have a response, but I can defer to my colleague, Mr. Vicaire.
Yeah, I'm sorry, you're breaking up.
I'll jump in to address the question then, Senator, as Mr. Vicaire is having trouble hearing. I think that's correct. Our concern is about how the projects are scoped, and so I think it's difficult. As Mr. Vicaire emphasized, we're not against economic development. We're not even against oil and gas development per se. It's about scoping the impacts of that and making sure you've taken all the impacts into account. So the main concern advanced by MTI with the lack of consultation was the fact that they scoped out marine shipping with the end result that MTI was never, in fact, no First Nation was ever consulted regarding the impacts of marine shipping and the potential impacts that would have on species that migrate through that area as well as surrounding fisheries. So that's the main concern is when looking at these types of projects, you have to, if you're trying to weigh the pros and cons and you scope it in such a way that you've ignored some of the cons or ignored some of the valid concerns, those concerns can't be addressed. And that was the perspective we advanced in court, was simply the Mi'gmaw were never consulted, that factor was never properly weighed in the impact assessment process.
Okay, thanks very much for the clarity of your responses. I appreciate it.
Senator Aucoin.
Merci,
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to ask my question in French. If you have any problem hearing, please let me know. So if I understand, you're not necessarily against the development project. It's just that you would have preferred that MTI be consulted, among other things, on shipping. And when you use that term, I assume that you mean an increase in the shipping traffic related to the extraction project, the transportation of oil from the oil rig, for example, the equipment that would be necessary to travel there. So am I right to understand that this is what your concern, where your concerns lie, and you have conducted a study? And how far along is that study? And do you have it, or are you just waiting for the government to review it, or would you like to sit down with the government, or what is the situation really with regard to that?
Dean, did you want to respond to that question? Okay, he's still having problems. Je crois, Sénateur, que j'ai bien.
Senator, I believe I understood your question in French, but I'll answer in English.
So, one of the concerns with this project also was that both neither SIA nor the proponents provided adequate funding to do a fulsome Indigenous knowledge study, Senator. And so we were never really properly in a position to ascertain exactly what the project impacts on salmon might be. We had a degree of Indigenous knowledge for that area and conducted a very limited Indigenous knowledge study that allowed us to determine the migratory route of the salmon and at a very high level what the impacts might be, but no one was willing to fund an Indigenous knowledge, a comprehensive Indigenous knowledge study that really would have allowed us to look at the impacts in any detail. So that's certainly a concern with how the process unfolded as well. And it really is important. Like I emphasize the importance of, for consultation to be meaningful, either the proponents or the Crown have to provide capacity to First Nations to be able to participate meaningfully in that process. And that includes properly funding Indigenous knowledge studies. We don't have this knowledge sitting in a book on a shelf in someone's office. It resides with community members. It resides with community members that are out on the lands and waters. And we need to go and we need to ask them the right questions about their knowledge of that particular area. In this case, like as I said, we were able to get some high-level knowledge that spoke to the migratory routes, that spoke at a very high level to some of the impacts, but a more detailed Indigenous knowledge study would have told us a lot more about specifically how marine shipping, for example, might impact those rights. And so, again, I really emphasize the importance of providing capacity support to First Nations to participate in these processes in a meaningful way. And I hope that addresses the question. If it doesn't, happy to receive a follow-up.
Merci.
Thank you. I have an additional question regarding salmon. I understand that it is an essential commodity that's very important to the Mi'gmaw people, and it has a symbolic value and a great deal of history attached to it. And I think that the migratory routes are along the coast for salmon. And in that case, if there was a spill, I could suppose that if a spill occurred and that if it moved toward the coast, it could cause a problem. But because it's 500 kilometers offshore, I'm wondering whether that industry, or whether if a spill occurred, whether it would really have an impact on the salmon or other species. But as you spoke mainly about salmon, could you respond to that, please? Thank you, sir.
It's a very good question, Senator. First of all, the science on what happens to salmon at sea is still extremely limited. It's a bit of a black box. They go into the ocean, and we know that Atlantic salmon are currently suffering very high mortality rates, but we don't, with a high degree of certainty, know why. And so we talk about the impacts of things like the Greenland fishery and what different impacts might be. But there's still a lot of debate about what precisely salmon do when they go to sea. One of our knowledge holders, Fred Metallic, who is from Mr. Vicare's community of Listaguch, talks about the salmon and how they go and they have a Maui-omi, which means a gathering in Mi'gmaw, off of Greenland, and they meet up with the salmon from Europe and they exchange knowledge. And knowledge like that helps inform our assessment. But from a scientific perspective, as well as an Indigenous knowledge perspective, there's limited knowledge. What we did do was we had confirmation from knowledge holders of where the migratory routes were, and that was subsequently confirmed by DFO, and that did fall within the project footprint. So DFO absolutely confirmed the information that falls within the project footprint. Again, the marine shipping passes through the migratory route as well. So it's not just about where the rigs themselves are located, but also where the ships transporting the gear and where the ships transporting the oil are going to go. And that crosses the migratory route as well. So I can say that based on the Indigenous knowledge and then subsequently confirmed by DFO science, we were able to establish that the migratory routes of salmon would be impacted by this oil and gas development one way or another. So I hope that answers your question.
Merci. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Donc, un déplacement du pétrole.
Witnesses with your presentation. It's very interesting. You talked early in your presentation about a court challenge. Has that been completed? And within the challenge was this right duty to consult and all the things you're talking about, was that addressed during that challenge?
Yeah, we're currently waiting on a decision from the Federal Court of Appeal, Senator, and lack of consultation is the central issue in that challenge.
So it's still in a lot of ways, a lot of it could be determined by what the court says.
Still before the courts. I mean, I will emphasize that even as a lawyer, I prefer not to have the courts tell us how to resolve these issues. I think these issues are best addressed through meaningful dialogue between the Crown and First Nations. And as I emphasized earlier, when this project went through, the Mi'gmaw Rights Impact Assessment process was not yet in place. And so we didn't have a particular process that we were asking the Crown to follow in terms of impact assessment. That process is now in place, and we're asking the Crown to respect that. And it's a very straightforward process. It's about a 30-page guide. It's based on 8 steps, 11 principles, and basically tells you how the Mi'gmaw are going to determine impacts on their rights, how they want to be consulted about projects like this. It's been very well received by proponents, I will say. The general feedback we've gotten from proponents is this is actually much clearer than anything the Crown gives them in terms of how to carry out the duty to consult. We've had proponents like the Port of St. John stand up and say this is one of the most, this is one of the best processes they've ever been through in terms of how it's structured and organized. We worked with a software company and developed software to automate the process, so a proponent can go in, enter the information about their project. Once that project description is complete, it assigns the appropriate staff, the process is initiated, we can pull in our IK data, our Indigenous knowledge data for that area. So it's a very straightforward process from a proponent standpoint. Sometimes takes a little longer than they'd like, but we're working on ways to speed up those timelines and make sure that projects. So again, back to Mr. Vicare's point, the Mi'gmaw and New Brunswick are not anti-development. What we're saying is this is a process you can go through to achieve Mi'gmaw consent for your project, and it will lay out very clear conditions, accommodations that are required, that sort of thing. So probably went a bit beyond the scope of your question, but
if I could just add to that, I mean, with this process, there have been and continue to be proponents that are abiding by it, and as a result, as any profitable organization can attest to, it's when you follow the MRIA process, you're on time and on budget, despite the fact that it may take a little longer, but there are no hurdles along the way to disrupt the process of conducting business. So it's something that we are really pushing to any and all proponents, to any and all level of governments as well. I apologize earlier for not being able to respond to the French. For some reason, the translation is not coming through. So just wanted to make that point. So thank you.
The question, and congratulations on the strides you've made, and hopefully as it goes forward, and if there are more opportunities for consultation, that you have a system in place there that sounds greatly improved over where it has been in the past. Thank you.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Senator Coyle.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses, Mr. Vicaire and Mr. Simon. I, too, am really, really encouraged to hear about this consultation guidelines that you've established for consultation on significant projects with Mi'gmaw people. This is something that has been much needed, as you well know, forever. I've sat for many years on the Indigenous Peoples Committee of the Senate, and it's something that is always getting in the way, of moving forward for anybody. So kudos to you on that. I understand that the main issue is here, there's a concern about oil tanker shipping routes impacting possibly impacting the salmon migration routes, and salmon being such an essential, entity, being, source of nutrition, source of cultural relevance, economy, all of those things to Mi'gmaw people. And I'm from Mi'gmawe'l, I'm from Antigonish, Nova Scotia, right next to Bucktinkek. So I know what you're talking about. And what I am curious about is whether you have, and what you would like is for the government to follow these guidelines on the consultation necessary for the impact assessment. What I'm curious about is whether you have seen in other locations in Canada, maybe the West Coast, or in other places around the world, where there's an interaction between oil tanker shipping and migration routes for other important, either salmon or other important species of fish, and what results might have come from those interactions or those impact assessments.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I'm sure the question's still out there, and for people to participate. I personally don't know of any. I know out in New Zealand there has been discussion and agreements that have been made there, but anywhere here in Canada, we're really looking for this MRIA process to be the model. Again, it's we without coming across as an organization trying to sell something, we're trying to convince people to open their eyes and ears and embrace this process, because again, it's on time, it's on budget, it's done in a way where it's sustainable and respects Mother Earth, and at the same time, prevents any potential hurdles that could be in the way, as you and the other senator had mentioned, in the past, where it really not infringes, but limits the speed of which business is to occur. So I really feel that this process is there to if government would embrace it, then certainly shipping magnates would have to embrace it as well and learn more about it. I'm not sure if my colleague is aware of any other, but I personally am not.
Yeah, I think that's something that under our current process would be looked at. So MTI is always happy to talk to other Indigenous peoples, particularly in other parts of the country or even other parts of the world, as Mr. Vicaire alluded to, about their experience with these types of things. Because it's not just, sometimes you don't just want to get the studies, you want to get the on-the-ground reality and lived experience of the people that are on the land. Fortunately, the scope of this process was such that didn't occur, but I think that for a project where a proper case study was done and the MRIA process was followed, that would definitely occur, Madam Senator. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we were wondering if you might send this framework to the committee so we could have it as part of our evidence. Obviously, some of the senators have found it to be, intriguing and a possible solution for more than just the Mi'gmaw people. So do you think you might be able to provide us with that?
I can respond to that with a resounding yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much. Senator McCallum.
Thank you. And thank you for your presentations. I wanted to just make a remark about the, when you said that boundaries are colonial the boundaries by provinces are colonial boundaries, that and we didn't have them as First Nations people, and that the territory expanded more. It was huge. When we did the Canada, Newfoundland and Labrador Atlantic Accord implementation, their Indigenous representative was actually a chief from Saskatchewan. They had not involved any Mi'gmaw people. And I had a letter from the chiefs from Mi'gmaw to say we were not consulted. So I just wanted to put that on the table, that it's just not right for the government to bring in people that think like them, so it makes it easier. So I also wanted to extend an invitation. We're doing a duty to consult in APA, and that's our next study. And if you could forward your information, I will put your name down to come as witnesses. Okay? Duty to consult. So when you have not been consulted, the decisions have been made, the project is underway, and now the accommodation to the people impacted, to your MTI, would need to be greater, right? The accommodation after. How would accommodation look like now? What is it? What I can't see how consultation after everything has been done, what would it accomplish? And what are the accommodations that you're looking for, considering that the oil, it's being built, the tankers are going to go. What is it here that you would like to make an impact on, or a change to, or?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Senator. And with all due respect to leadership and the chiefs and communities that MTI represents, that would have to be taken back, and individually discussed with each of their, counselors, and probably most important, their community members. Quite often, throwing money at something is never the solution. We've seen that time and time again. Taking a more holistic approach to accommodation in the means of education, in the means of understanding, sharing an opportunity at a level table, so to speak, to share Indigenous knowledge where it's welcomed and ultimately understood, I think will prove dividends in terms of preventing this sort of conduct from big business at any given time. That I can answer with certainty. How it would look individually is not my place here to respond to that, but it is a question that I will most certainly, and my colleague and I will be bringing back to leadership as well.
Yeah, it's hard to comment, Senator, on what accommodations might have flowed from a flawed consultation process. I can speak to the types of, so again, the MRI process is geared towards obtaining Mi'gmaw consent, and that consent is usually based on certain conditions. So typical conditions that we've seen for other projects of this type are projects that involve shipping or transportation impacts. Monitoring is a common measure that's undertaken. Sometimes there's time of day or time of year restrictions with respect to when certain activities occur. So there might be some limits around how and when and where shipping occurs to ensure that it has minimal impact on the migratory season. So you look at what time of year the salmon are migrating through that footprint, and are there limitations or restrictions that can be put in place that might limit the impacts on salmon. Those are the types of things we'd look at. And I should emphasize too, I think, because you spoke about sort of the scope of the impacts, the process does scale up or down, and the types of accommodations that are required are always tied to the scale of the impacts of the project. So obviously something like a park bench is going to attract a much less rigorous level of consultation and types of accommodation measures than a pipeline. And many projects are actually deemed to have a minimal impact, and therefore they're scoped out after step two of the process. So the process does have some flexibility to scale up or down. But I think we come back to the fact that we would still want a proper IK study to be conducted for this project, which would allow us to determine precisely what the impacts are, what knowledge is out there with respect to salmon, and that would in turn inform the accommodations that are necessary.
Can I have one more question?
Second round.
Okay.
Okay. Senator Galvez.
Thank you so much. Me too, I want to congratulate you and for your efforts of creating new material way guidelines and approaches for the consultation, and also to encourage you to keep educating people about regional impacts. I remember at the beginning of when we assess projects, we see it as a dot. It's a dot, it's punctual, it's just this, and it doesn't impact nothing else, so we just look at this. And which was completely incoherent with the way the world works. And so listening to you, it reminds me so much the project in Anticosti Island, where there was a project to exploit gas. And exactly the same thing, nobody wanted to talk about the shipping, even though they're going to produce a lot of gas. And it's like, maybe they thought they were going to fly it to wherever the market was. But I remember looking at the issues with the salmon. So what I found at that time was that they enter coastal waters of Newfoundland or Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. They moved through nearshore marine corridors into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where it was the Anticosti and the Madeleine Islands, which is a tourist attraction. And from there, they passed through Cabo de Strait or the Strait of Belle Isle into the North Atlantic. So for scientists to map all that, it's not impossible, but it takes a lot of time. And this is where the indigenous knowledge comes so handy to establish this. And so I want to encourage you to keep showing us the bigger picture to see the regional impacts and the cumulative impacts. And so my question to you is like, in that sense of visioning the whole thing, because when I was looking at Anticosti, we were just talking about belugas. And you see, you just open my eyes and see, okay, salmon are there too. So I know that salmon is very important for you and your culture, but if you can educate me about other relationships, the web, the food web, the biofood web, that it can be impacted if there is, God forbid, an oil spill.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm from Listugush, which sits on the famous Restigouche River, known for angling salmon and world renowned. Just this summer, my young children and my wife were biking along a trail along the river, and we saw 3 beluga whales in the river. Now, what is that, right? That is even bizarre to me. I've never seen that in my life. But I shared that with elders, and they said that they were here in plenty back in time, and the idea that they're here again is in our language. He said it's like a warning. because they shouldn't really be here at this time, but they're here. And it wasn't just one, it was a pod of them, right? Sorry about that. In a very small area in our river. So the knowledge, I've learned, I'd love to share that. So this is the type of knowledge that I would bring to our elders here that are our Indigenous knowledge holders and share that. Another example, when I mentioned earlier about other marine life, it's not just the salmon, obviously, but we talk about the endangered North Atlantic right whale. DFO now is learning by communicating with us in a very meaningful way that, and it's been used out west, this the idea of whale safe gear, to put that industry out in the middle of an ocean with smack dab in the middle of their migratory patterns is challenging to say the least. But again, through our process, and this process is built and supported upon Indigenous knowledge holders, elders, fishermen, that have a long history within the family of fishing and being on the rivers and the oceans. That's all built upon that. And all we've been, I wouldn't say asking for, but more demanding, to be quite frank, is a seat at the table where our information can be shared, which generates knowledge, which will ultimately assist, the scientist in the two-eyed seeing approach, where you have Indigenous knowledge and Western scientific knowledge. It doesn't have to be separated. It could be going together in tandem, which will prove dividends for all of us, all of us and the generations to come.
Thank you. Senator McCallum, unless there's another first round question. Senator McCallum?
Okay, I wanted to go to cultural heritage. So when we look at cultural heritage in this situation, we're looking at the salmon. When we look at what lies below the salmon, which is the intangible cultural heritage, you can't see it, and it's and what falls with the fishing. I went to Haida Gwaii. I work with other groups that are looking at sturgeon, and the knowledge translation, the culture involves knowledge translation. It's about building kinship when you are practicing that ceremony or that activity. It is about the oral histories that go as you're fishing. It's the connection between the grandfathers, the fathers, the children. So there's a huge host of culture that is being decimated at the same time when you have starting to get limited chances to practice that culture. Can you talk to us a bit about the cultural heritage that exists there and what it brings? Because it is, when we look at what's happening, and the consultation isn't happening, it's all across Canada, it's a form of cultural genocide. So can you speak a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I just, so much to say, but I'm going to do my best to condense it and provide a closed notes version of it. As I mentioned in my opening statements, Blamu, as we know as salmon, is conducive to our existence. Without it, we won't be here. Much like the Haida Gwaii, as you mentioned out in the West, you take away those trees, the Haida Gwaii will not be there. Our ancestors quite often would say, are you on the land or are you from the land? Are you on the water or from the water? And you just basic, the English language can be helpful at times to distinguish that. it's everything to us. Without the salmon existing, the Ilnu will suffer greatly. Not to mention, the introduced species of the striped bass and the damage that that's causing to the salmon population up in our tributaries is decimating the salmon, is decimating as an apex predator. The striped bass are not just decimating the salmon, but everything else below it. As it's so defined what an apex predator is, and so you add in. I mean, it's baffling the gamut or the gauntlet that a salmon has to go through. But it is conducive to our existence. The resiliency of the salmon is the resiliency of our people. The success of the salmon is the success of our people. In Listugush, we have our own fisheries plan, that has been celebrated by Canadian governments and received an award. So if you allow us to be part of the table with an open heart and open mind to get things done, then certainly we can have that ability to share that, not only to, the idea of cultural genocide and that negative impact. We all know that history. I would, as a former educator, I would beg and plead with anyone and any of you to provide the guidance where that history should be embedded within the pedagogy and curriculum of the schools. Because out here on this side of Turtle Island, it's still not in the schools, and we still find ourselves dealing generation after generation. I'm old enough to say that a couple generations to say that we're just repeating ourselves, and Groundhog Day just passed, but this is Groundhog Day for us every day. And but to speak of that cultural impact that the salmon have, that the whales have on us, with us, for us, all about us, it is immeasurable. And I could continue on, but to give my colleague here an opportunity, Derek, to comment. His wife is a Mi'gmaw woman who lives and breeds with the land, and he has input there as well. So I'd like to provide an opportunity, Derek.
Yeah, and I think this ties in nicely to the question Senator Galvez was raising as well, which is, the relationship is not just with the salmon, it's with the territory and all the marine species in it as a whole. And they're all interrelated, and you can't isolate any one. And one of the fundamental issues MTI has always had with how, for example, DFO manages the fishery is it's done in a very siloed species-specific way. And so you have people that focus on the salmon and nothing but the salmon. You have people that focus on the striped bass and nothing but the striped bass. And those people aren't really talking to each other. And yet there's a huge interaction, as Mr. Vicaire alluded to, between striped bass and salmon, where a rebound in the striped bass population is now negatively impacting the salmon population. The salmon are already facing a number of stressors, from striped bass to climate change is a huge factor. They're a cold water species. They do not like temperatures, and we're seeing in the rivers in New Brunswick as well as elsewhere throughout the territory the impacts that warming waters, the negative impacts that warming waters are having on salmon, to the point where it looks like DFO is ready to abandon efforts to protect the inner Bay of Fundy salmon. So a decision like that, Senator, you're right. It is in effect an act of cultural genocide. This is a species that the Mi'gmaw have had a relationship with for 15,000 years. And all of a sudden DFO is saying, due to a variety of factors, including financial considerations, we can no longer support efforts to restock, to resuscitate, to bring back the salmon in southwestern New Brunswick in a critical part of our territory near Amlamok First Nation. And that destroys, and we don't want to see that happen to the other salmon populations in the region, be it the population in the Miramichi, the population in the Restigouche, or elsewhere. And projects like the oil and gas development in eastern Newfoundland are just one more factor that has the potential to negatively impact the salmon population. We want to make sure those impacts are appropriately addressed and accommodated and mitigated, because they don't need one more stressor.
Thank you. we're almost at the end of our time. Is there one short comment left, or can I go on to thank our... Yes, Senator Galvez.
Okay, very quickly, because I think hearing you, I'm tempted to ask you this question. In Western society, we don't see how nature relates to economy. And when I talk to land trust people, indigenous people defending nature, I like saying that my province of Quebec wouldn't be what it is without nature. We have hydroelectric power because of the mighty rivers in Quebec. We have 1 billion industry based on maple syrup because, we own this market in the world. And we rely on critical minerals and minerals to export, and that's natural resources. So I will say that 90% of our GDP in Quebec is based on ecological services. But not many people agree with me about this, okay? And so I have to show the numbers and I have to show this. And so then you get people, okay, I see it. How do you see this? In 3 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah,
please.
yeah. This is the forever and always challenge, right? Again, if MTI is in a position where we have 9 communities, and together we're stronger, to at least demand a seat at the table. Once provided that seat, we're able to share this information. This is what we do on a daily basis, Senator, and it's forever and always happening. I'll turn to Derek here for a minute left, I guess, or a minute and a half left.
Yeah, again, the Mi'gmaw have been in their territory since at least the end of the last ice age, and have seen shifts in climate, have seen changes in how the territory is unfolded, and have lived through all of that, and the culture and language very much come from the land, and so I think nobody knows better than the Mi'gmaw the importance of ecosystem services of the natural environment in terms of providing for the people. One of the concerns with the decline of salmon is that literally puts food on people's plate in our communities. And so you lose that, and you lose it forever. It's a cultural loss, but it's also an economic loss, because now you have to find a way to replace that food source with something else. And what's it going to be? So at the end of the day, we talk about the economy and people, but it comes down to a question of people being able to feed their families, people being able to put food on their plate in a way that has sustained their ancestors for 15,000 years or more. And to lose that is an immeasurable cultural loss, as well as a loss in an economic sense, because now you have to find another way to feed your family. So that's the very practical reality that we face, I think.
And from a big business standpoint, if I may, is going to, decimate the Atlantic Salmon Federation and the Maritime Fisheries Union, where they have been benefiting from this for quite some time, and we're in the, in the range of billions of dollars. So it's not just going to impact us; it's going to impact everyone. And I think there's no better way than to end that this session by that statement.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator. And thank you to our witnesses. Mr. Vicaire, very nice to see you again so soon.
Yes,
and thank you,
sure.
Mr. Simon, as well, for your the evidence you gave and the insight that we've gained from both of your testimonies. So thank you. And I would just say that our next meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, February 10th at 6:30 p.m. And that's it. I call this meeting adjourned.